Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
We're going to be in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12 today. This is usually the first division of the second half of the Ten Commandments that some would say begins our obligations toward our fellow man, here our family. But I want to say to you, I'm not sure we've divided this thing up right. We know there's 10 because the 10 words are the Hebrew title for this. As you know, the Jews begin in verse 1, the Lord your God. They make that the commandment number 1. And so they have to number it different down through. Now, Catholics and Lutherans and some Protestants have differed over how you divide it. I think because there's been some difficulty in dividing it in history, we need to see that sometimes it's our presuppositions that try to divide it, not the holistic philosophy of life of the Hebrews. And since I believe that there is a cultural pattern behind this, and of course that's the Hittite Suzerain treaties, where there are 2 copies of these contracts given, one to the king to place in the into the house of his God to be read, and the other to the people. I really think the 2 halves of the commandments both had all the laws on them. So I think we've misunderstood that by putting it in our Western framework, where we've kind of divided up the sacred and the secular, that which belongs to God and that which belongs to the world, or in this case, our relationship with God versus our relationship with our family and our covenant neighbors. But I think in the Jewish scheme of things, all of life belongs to God. And God relates to all of it. It's kind of like, you know how we make the distinction sometime between this is the ceremonial law, this is the moral law of the Old Testament. The Jews never felt that. That's our Western dichotomy, not the Jews. And so let's don't do too much of a number on that, okay? Now, this little thing, honor your father and your mother. Several things I want to say here. The word honor is related to the Hebrew word for glory, which means to be heavy. Same as kadosh. Now, this heaviness meant that it had worth. That which is light, like in the word vain, take the Lord's name in vain, we looked at a few weeks earlier, meant to be light. Take something too lightly, frivolously, of no worth. What does it mean we are to honor, give due weight to? Well, does that mean lifelong control? I think not. I don't think it means that. I was noticing 2 New Testament passages that I think you might want to jot down. Honor does not mean control. Cf. Luke 9:59 through 62. Honor does not mean, as long as your feet are under my table, you'll do what I say. No. Honor is lifelong respect. 1 Timothy 5, verses 4 and 8. We need to hear both of those, I think. How do we give due weight to our parents? Well, first of all, I want to say this may surprise you, but think about it. This is not a commandment for children. This is not written to young people. This is written to the parents of young people. Now, what is God saying to parents about their parents? Well, we've got to note that there's a societal difference in the ancient Orient as well as in the modern Orient. Multiple generation families are quite common, and respect in that family unit for the older people was quite significant. I think our society is put to shame by Oriental societies and their treatment of the age. We have a deified youth. Well, deified youth or not, that's not here or there, but it is here or there how we treat our parents, no matter how old they become or how young or old we are. Now, as we develop this, I think we'll see a theological reason behind that and why. Notice that both parents are to be given respect. Now, that's important. Honor your father and mother. Now, we all know it's a patriarchal society, but the mother was always a significant person, always a covenantal partner, always due respect and equality. I think Proverbs 31 says something of the Hebrew view of motherhood. And there are several times in the Old Testament that God is described in feminine terms. The Spirit brooded over the waters. I bore you on eagle's wing. Those are mother bird words. Jesus used mother bird one time when he said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets, how I would have gathered you together as a hen does her chicks, but you would not. So I think this idea about women being put down some, we see that in the society it was treated differently. There was always respect for God's working through ladies. I think another thing about this, give due honor to. We've divided it into our relationship to God versus our relationship to our family and fellow man. But I really think that parents stand in an authority relationship between God and children, at least in their young life. And therefore, this God-given authority to which young people and older children respond to is, in a sense, their respect for God through these individuals who bore them by the grace of God. So in a sense, like the first four, this is also how to do life and respect God. I think all these commandments really deal with God. We don't steal because we may get caught and hurt. We don't steal because we're God's children. I think the only way to interpret these is in light of the covenant. I really do. Now, this God-given parental authority, I think, can be seen very clearly in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now, remember, the parallel is in Deuteronomy 5. So Deuteronomy 6 is the immediate context after the parallel giving. This is what it says in Deuteronomy 6, 6 through 9. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons. You shall talk with them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. What's that mean? The law of God, the will of God, in worship and in society, was meant to be a constantly meditated thing, constantly lived out in daily life, communicated to our children both verbally, exemplary, and every other way we could think of. So the parents did have a place of passing on the faith. It only takes one generation to fumble the ball. Now, I grant you that the Jews tend to be too legalistic. They passed on rules instead of relationship. Aren't you glad we never do that? Parents are responsible for covenant training. Therefore, to honor one's parents is in some respects to honor God. Now, I was looking at Leviticus 19:3. And notice that the word, for every one of you shall reverence his mother and father. That word fear or awe, translated fear in King James, reverence here in New American Standard, is only used for God. And yet here it's used for mother and father. Every one of you shall reverence his mother. Notice mother comes first. And father. And you shall keep my Sabbaths. I'm the Lord your God. Notice Sabbath keeping, which was the earlier command, related to parental honor, which shows they're both theological. I think that's very significant and says not only about our numbering, but about our dichotomy of life into secular and sacred. Okay. The aged, not only parents, but aged in general are to be honored. Because the way we honor parents and the elderly is going to say something about the stability of our society. We go back to Leviticus 19 again, this time verse 32. You shall not raise up before the gray-headed, and honor the aged, and you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. Notice that honor for the aged and reverence toward God are again linked. Maybe God knew that children that show respect are children that have covenant respect, that have covenant faith. There's a connection here. I think it's very important. Now, I was going to mention also, remember the book of Proverbs, particularly Proverbs 1 through 9, where the common teacher of all the young boys calls them his son and they call him his father? Sometimes teachers are addressed in parental terms, and they were to be honored. Again, I want to say these commandments are not for children, but for parents. Parents in a social context of multiple generations living under one roof. Now, a little phrase, that your days may be prolonged in the land. Boy, this has caused a lot of discussion. I'm in Deuteronomy, and I'd like to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 40, for I think it helps us understand this. So you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I am giving you today, that it may be well with you and with your children after you, that you may live long on the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. Now turn over to chapter 5, verse 33. You shall walk in the way which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, that you may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord shall possess. Now, some have interpreted this based on Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6, which says, this is Ephesians 6:2. You must honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise to make it good, so that you may prosper and live a long life on the earth. That's meant to be a quote from this. Some interpret that along with Deuteronomy 6:2, which says, you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God and keep his statutes and commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. Now, here's the two views. One says, if you're good to parents, it's going to show your lifestyle is such that there's going to be longevity built into your individual life. You personally are going to live a long time. But Deuteronomy 4:40 and 5:33 seem to say that respect for the aged, respect for parents, is a sign of a stable society that will stay in the promised land a long time because it's covenant respect for God. Now, I think both may be true, but I tend to think because of the phrase maybe long in the land, used in different ways than individual longevity in the book of Deuteronomy, that it's probably a societal promise, not an individual promise. So you're saying to yourself, well, I know somebody who was really good to his parents, and he got hit by a car and died at 22. Well, you can't make this an individual thing in every case. It's not meant to be that kind of promise. But it is, I think, a sign that those children who have this kind of lifestyle are going to tend to live longer. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, there's an Egyptian sage, there's wisdom literature was in Egypt as well as Israel. His name is Atet-Hopep, and he says this: the son who accepts the words of his father will grow old in consequence of so doing. And again he said, the obedient son will be happy by reason of his obedience. He will grow old, and he will come to favor, as a proof that he is referring to personal longevity. Maybe so. The Israelite conception of the promised land is very important in this covenant keeping. Remember, the longevity was connected to in the promised land. Now, I think it's significant for us to say that the promised land was part of the Abrahamic covenant. The Old Testament emphasizes the land, for the New Testament emphasizes the other aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, which is the seed, the line of the Messiah. There is a couple of negative parallels, and these are going to be shocking to you because in our society they're so different. We wouldn't think of doing this, but I want you to turn to Exodus 21:15 for just a second. Listen to this. He who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death. And turn over to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9. Listen to this. If there is anyone who curses his father or his mother, he shall be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother. His blood guiltiness is upon himself. Oh, my. Look at Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21. Listen to this one. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father and his mother, and when they chasten him, he will not even listen to them, and his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown, and they shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious, he will not obey us, he is a glutton and a drunkard, and all the men of that city will stone him to death. And so he shall be removed the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear of it and fear. Remember the first time I told a group of young people about this, and I said, if we just stoned a couple of y'all, I bet the rest of you would clean your act up. They thought it was real funny. I bet the teenagers in the Jewish society didn't laugh much at this, but it is shocking. Jesus mentions some of the abuse that parents were put through, even in God's name, in His day. And you might want to see Matthew 15, verses 3 through 9, related to the improper use of the korban, or that which is dedicated to God. The children would say, look, we'd love to help you, Mom and Dad, and we know you need some help, but we've given all our money to God that we don't use, and we just can't help you with God's money. Too much hadn't changed, has it? Which the Lord your God gives you. Notice the continual emphasis not only on redemption, going back to the preamble to the 10 words, but the continuing emphasis on the gracious gift of God. Now, God called Abraham for a purpose. Remember, the call came in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22. And God remade this covenant. But the covenant had universal implications back in chapter 12, 1 through 3. And all the nations shall be blessed. I think this universal blessing is the key to our understanding these 10 commandments. God gave them this land. He knew there was going to be a lot of fighting through here. Countries would march through it. But He gave them a land where they would be exposed to the rest of the world. What for? For the purpose of being a kingdom of priests. If you miss Exodus 19:5 in connection with these 10 commandments in Exodus 20, you'll miss the purpose of God. He wanted a different people. He wanted a unique people. He wanted a people called by His name to accomplish His purpose, which is what? The redemption of the world. For all the world belongs to Him. It's said so beautifully in Ezekiel 18:32 that He wants every individual to be saved. And I think the way we treat our parents is going to be something attractive, like the way we treat our wives, like the way we treat our God, to those who are searching in darkness. Many commentators have noticed that the covenant name for God, YHWH, translated in your English translation as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, from the Hebrew verb to be, explained in Exodus 3:14, is in this verse. Now, it's in verse 2, and it's in verse 5, and it's in verse 7, and it's in verse 10. But now all those had to do with this dividing up of the commandments into those are our relationship to God. And here we are in verse 12, which many people say, no, that's not a relationship between man, but God's name comes in again. I think the fact that God's name appears in the second half of this list shows there isn't a second half. It's all related to how we treat the covenant God. But this way. We often divide the commandments into our vertical relationship and our horizontal relationship. I think Jesus said it so well when He said, the way you sum up the law and the prophets is, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, though we may think that's two movements, that's really one movement. For our relationship with God is what gives us the ability to relate to others. If we don't know Him, we're not going to be able to function in a society with love and respect, in covenant obedience. So I just don't think there's two halves of these things, to tell you the truth. It is significant to notice that our faith toward God affects all of our life. How we act in worship must be reduplicated in daily interpersonal relationship. It's so hard to teach. I have 3 children. It's so hard to teach them that I want to relate to them. I want to be friends. But there is a sense in which how they treat me says something about how they're going to treat God. And by that I mean, when you really understand the Christian faith, it impacts life on every area and in every relationship. Children need to obey their parents, not for their parents' sake, but for the children's sake. Parents need to teach their children respect, not so that the parents will be honored, but so that God will be honored. Because the society that has strong interpersonal relationships respect for one another's rights, love over several generations, is a society that's going to have a love for God. Because I want to tell you, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, it's hard to get along with in-laws. It's hard to get along with spouses. Boy, it's hard to get along with teenagers. But maybe it says as much about parents. Don't exasperate your children in the Lord. Now I'm bringing that in from where? Paul in Ephesians 6. You see, he puts the reciprocal relationship coming where the Ten Commandments only puts the one relationship. Children are to honor parents all the days of their life. Parents are to honor children. When we have that relationship, the same thing is true between husband and wife. Husband and wife are related. Not only because they got to have a hormone spike every time they see or touch each other, but because God's involved in this thing. Marriage involves God. Children have family involves God. Life involves God. It involves God when we relate to our in-laws who live under our roof that sometimes want to discipline different than we do. You see what I'm saying? And the multiple generation families had even more tension in a fast, mobile society like us. And yet, it was God's will that through honoring parents, the society would be a godly society, a stable society. And I want to tell you, one of the neatest books on the Ten Commandments I've found is by Elton Trueblood. I hope you know him. And it's called Restructuring the Foundation or Rebuilding the Foundation. He says that these Ten Commandments can be guidelines for rebuilding all societies in Western culture. There's some truth in that. Why? Because there's some real underpinnings, some real philosophical truths behind these what seem to be just simple rules. And they're much, much more than that. How we act in worship must be duplicated in daily interpersonal relationships. God wanted and still wants a kingdom of priests to attract, convict, and introduce a lost world to Himself. The joy and stability of believing homes is a bright beacon of hope amidst a world of turmoil. You say, yeah, Bob, but that's talking about the Old Testament being a kingdom of priests. Oh, really? Did you know in 1 Peter 2, 5, and 9, and in Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, the same phrase, kingdom of priests, is used for the church? God did not save us because He loves us so much. He saved us because He wants to use us as a channel to save the entire world. Christian homes, if they're not different in quality from non-Christian homes, have radically failed in their admonitions of the children about the Lord. Amen? I think we've got to say that. Now let's see, I had one more thought I wanted to bring up. Okay, here's the reciprocal relationship, I think, between parents and children from a New Testament perspective. Would you write down Colossians 3:21 and Ephesians 4:6, how parents should act, and children, Ephesians 6:1 through 3. And again, I want to say, honor is a lifelong task. 1 Timothy 5:4 through 8. And it's for all generations. The commandment is for parents. Our respect for the aged, be them our parents or not, will say something about our society. Well, at this point, I want to show you a couple of books who have helped me to study for this, because these commandments are kind of hard to study for, because you want the original context, and sometimes it's hard for us in Western society to understand an Oriental multi-generation family. One of my favorite set of reference books, this is Roland DeVoe, Ancient Israel. It has 2 volumes. This is the religious institutions, and this is the social institutions. It is extremely well indexed, both by subject and by scripture text. This will show you how they did life in an ancient world. There's no way to understand the Old Testament context unless we can get back into an Old Testament context. These little paperback books will really help you get back into a 1st century A.D. for the New Testament, but these particular books are going to get you back into a B.C. period. Now, one more that I think is going to help. This is available in English. It's put out by Silberman. This is the Pentateuch, which is Genesis through Deuteronomy, Rashi's comments. Now, grant you, one side of it is Hebrew, And the other side is English. So I don't know how good you are in Hebrew, but the English side will help. It'll give you a Jewish interpreter that's very textual but knows the rabbi's interpretation of these Old Testament. The only other person I would really recommend, I think he's right down over here in my bookcase, forgot where I put him, would be Alfred Edersheim. His Bible History in 2 volumes. He is a rabbi that I believe has been completed by finding Jesus as his Messiah, and he has written out of the background of his rabbinical understandings an interpretation of the Old Testament text. Another one that would be helpful to get back to a BC period that's highly indexed would be the writings of Flavius Josephus, who wrote during the days of Christ, and he wrote about the Jewish life and history to a Roman audience. And his book is available in paperback now. The Antiquities of the Jews deals with the Old Testament. And that's the one that's going to help you. Going to help you understand the cultural setting, thereby being able to interpret these more readily. Well, I hope as you pray through these and decide how they apply to your life, and I want to tell you, friend, they do apply to your life. Not how you're right with God, not how you're saved, but they certainly are inspired. And I believe they are God's guidelines for man in society, particularly covenant man. You mean, Bob, that the 10 Commandments can be a means of evangelism? Yes, they can. That's what they're meant to be. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. May the Lord bless you real good.